The difference between an HTML web form and a good HTML web form is that the latter fingerholds the user all the way to successful submission of the form. Forms are tricky. They have requirements and expectations in almost all user input fields, which are sometimes not obvious to users. Take the simplest web form found everywhere, that is sign up or user registration form, where you give email, password, and certain other information like address, phone, work experience, and whatnot. You fill out the lengthy form, press the submit button, and after a pause, find out that almost all user input fields are marked red, citing password did not meet length requirement, you can't use dash in address, phone number is missing the country code, and work experience was supposed to be 150 characters only while you type 500 characters. Frustrated as why those requirements were not mentioned upfront, especially the password, which is hardest to think and remember, you fix your mistakes, submit, and again get an error that password should also have a special character. If you still complete the form at this stage, I don't even need to list the emotions you would be feeling and have already established a bad first impression about the business. A good, well thought out UX goes a long way in keeping users happy. Well, that being a long shot, let's say less angry and agitated. Luckily for us, the HTML5 has a bunch of capabilities that one can use to do instant validation of entered fields without involving the server at all. Better still, you can provide users with instant feedback about what they need to do to recover. And I can't emphasize the word instant enough. Not only is that feedback truly instant, it also is more robust. See, server-side validation, which while still being very much required, is much harder to recover from, and you are much better off catching and fixing issues using client-side validation techniques. Conventional wisdom dictates that client-side validation means writing JavaScript code, which scares most of new web developers. Well, with HTML5, most of client-side validation does not require JavaScript and can be done with proper use of attributes on form input controls. Having said that, JavaScript is not out of the picture and is still sometimes necessary for custom validation as well as validation that goes beyond HTML5 built-in capabilities. I've designed this video to cover the HTML5 techniques first and then involving JavaScript later. Let me clarify what this video does and does not cover. We shall not venture into server-side validation in this one and will focus on client-side validation only. My primary focus would be on introducing the built-in validation techniques provided by HTML5 elements that you can use to do most of the validation. In later half, I will introduce JavaScript-based validation using HTML5 Constraint Validation API, which in plain English means enhancing the built-in validation, suggestion system, and error reporting capabilities of HTML5 to do custom validation while maintaining consistent UI for built-in and custom stuff. Some familiarity with CSS would also be required since we shall use CSS to convey errors and suggestions in some cases. We'll introduce concept first and introduce code later. You can use time markers or scroll bar chapter navigation to jump ahead. I'm Ali from Learn Awesome. Let's learn some awesome client-side validation with HTML5. I think I must answer a confusion upfront that client-side validation is not a substitute for server-side validation. If you are a full-stack developer, you would, should, must always do full server-side validation, even if you have kick-ass client-side validation setup. Server-side validation is not optional. I hope I conveyed it forcefully enough. Forms are still the number one way for evil people to attack, compromise, overwhelm, steal data, or destroy your website by corrupting your website or altogether deleting your data. So, what's the point of this duplicate effort on client side? Would be a very logical question. And luckily, I started the video with the answer. We are trying to make a good user-friendly website, and users unconsciously evaluate and make an impression about your website from little details. And with severe competition, instant feedback and error handling is expected by web-savvy users who can tell difference between good, bad, and ugly. It also reduces load on server where a user would have to press submit button a dozen times on large forms to fix issues that can be easily avoided. Client-side validation can be easily disabled by an attacker by disabling JavaScript in browser. In a nutshell, server-side validation is responsible for ensuring data does not contain any harmful scripts or SQL queries, etc., and add integrity checks to ensure data conforms to server-side data rules, while client-side validation gives user suggestions about requirements upfront, instant feedback in case entered data is not conformant, and error tips or feedbacks to recover from mistakes. Alright, finally we can start looking at HTML5 capabilities and appreciate the fact that it tries to minimize the coding effort required in earlier versions for input validation. Prior to HTML5, input validation was synonymous with scripting, and developer was pretty much left to find ways for reporting errors, suggestions, and alls by themselves, since there was no purposeful built-in support in underlying layer. As forms remained in picture for years upon years, patterns of common types of required inputs and recurring commonly used validation were identified, and rather than developers being left to handle errors in a haphazard, custom ways using scripting, most of these requirements were covered in form of type-based input elements with built-in checks, as well as attributes to let developers specify rules on input directly in HTML on input elements. The scripting for most cases is hidden from view and is mature enough to cover all common cases. And let us start with the basic required attribute on input controls. We all know that most websites present users with forms where they expect a minimal set of required information and a whole bunch of optional information. The required information is deal breaker like email, password, name, etc., without which user identity cannot be created in database successfully. While other information like names of his pets is optional information which is good if provided but won't stop the sign up process. You can use the attribute required in input control to make this distinction. And HTML5 won't let users submit data until user input fields with required attributes are filled. The most primitive validation on most input fields would require user to fill data with an appropriate size string. For example, you won't like to see a name column in your user table on server filled with names like E, X, 3, etc., right? Nor would you prefer passwords like ABC123, which can easily be hacked and your repute would come in question instead of the user whose data is stolen from your website with that easy to guess password. Similarly, a 500 character name would also not make sense. Min and max length attributes help you establish the first level of sanity check by enforcing constraint on the minimum and maximum length of input data in the control. Similar to min and max length, which apply to textual data, min and max are constraints on numerical input by the user. A user should not be able to sign up with age, say less than 12 or 18 on your website, and obviously should not be minus 4 years old. Similarly, a 500 years old user signing up should be a cause of concern for most people. Just taking age as a primitive example here, but numeric constraints apply to all sort of scenarios like experience, shoe size, miles to travel, test results, and whatnot. One should, at minimum, ensure user enter data is sane and falling within specified range. One of my favorite validation methods on input elements is type attribute, which can take a bunch of values like email, password, number, date, text, URL, checkbox, etc. By avoiding using the default value text in favor of one of these, automatically activates a whole bunch of built-in validations by HTML5, like ensuring a at the rate of sign exists in email, a date is, well, a date, a telephone number is not ABCD, etc. As a bonus, they also are amazing UX aid when using tablets or mobile devices, as browsers show user a customized keypad as per the type. For example, a number type would show a numeric keypad, email would show at the rate sign on keypad as well, tel would show the plus sign along with numeric entries, etc. Numbers can show a step up, step down control as well. Date would show a date picker, which would ensure user is forced to select a date and not something else. You get the idea. Pattern is the most useful and least understood validation method in HTML5. To understand pattern, you must be familiar with regular expressions, which, if you are not, are a standardized way of describing textual patterns, like a phone number often written as plus followed by two-digit country code, then space, then three-digit operator code, and then seven-digit number. Okay, phone numbers can get complicated. Let's stick to a simpler example of email address. So here goes. Easy peasy, right? Well, let me explain it would make sense. Anything enclosed in square bracket means it's expected at this point in string like, let's say, square bracket a dash z only with a plus sign afterwards would mean any sequence of characters between a and z repeating indefinitely. Or taking this example, this means a word made of case insensitive alphabets, numbers, underscore, dashes, and dots, repeating indefinitely. Let's call this thing from here to here alpha num dash dot. So now it makes sense that this regular expression means alpha num dash dot followed by an at the rate of sign, followed by another alpha num dash dot, then a dot, and then a 2 to 5 length limited alpha num dash dot like com, edu, etc. So in a nutshell, this part is the user ID, this part is the domain name, this is the .com, .edu, etc. Unfortunately, regular expression is a topic of its own and we simply cannot even begin to go in detail of it. But you get a sense that patterns attribute expects you to provide a pattern string against which user input would be evaluated and marked as conformant or not conformant. So in this example, $sign at usa.com would be validated, but $sign at usa.com would be rejected as this dollar character is neither an alphabet nor a number, underscore, dash, or dot. I would definitely add a regular expression video to my channel, so do check if it exists by now. Patterns or regular expressions are powerful validation tools and can even parse constituent parts like domain name from email address. Once you get a hang of it, you can use patterns to validate emails, dates, telephone numbers, URLs, and whatnot with these. Luckily, type attributes make use of built-in validation for many of these, but you must learn these as regular expressions are essential skills for any sort of programming. One final note about patterns before we move on is that if you use them, make sure they are accommodative for minor issues like some people write phone numbers with area code in brackets and some don't. And prompting them with errors for missing or required brackets would be incredibly frustrating for the visitor. Just be careful with their usage, and if you do your research and cover all cases and cultures, meaning avoid unnecessary errors. We are finally done with coverage of attributes on input elements that help you constrain the input data as per your requirement. It is time to see how you control the display of your form to convey important and timely information to your users via UX features. And of course, CSS is at the core of it, and validation relies heavily on pseudo-classes. Now, what are these pseudo-classes? See, all input elements undergo various states, like all input elements are in empty state when form is first displayed. As user fills it in, they transition to either valid or invalid states. CSS allows you to manipulate styling these controls based on their state by providing state-specific selectors, which are known as pseudo-classes. Unlike regular CSS classes, which you must be familiar with by now, which you define on an element, pseudo classes are pre-built and you just use them or not use them. So let's go over some examples to make it more clear. I'll first go over an example of usage and then we shall cover the right. In this example, we are using the required and optional pseudo classes available on input elements to indicate required versus optional form fields. Any input element which has required attribute set on it would have the corresponding required pseudo class available on it. So all such fields in a form would be shown with a brown border as per styling. The rest, where required attribute is not provided, would be shown with a black border. This way, we visually indicate to user which fields are required to be filled in to submit the form with just styling. Convenient, isn't it? We took the guesswork away with just a few lines of code. You can skip styling for optional and just add special styling for required as well. You can consider many of pseudo classes to be direct counterparts of some constraint attributes like min max here. If some numeric control has min max or min length or max length attributes present on them, you can use in range and out of range pseudo classes to visually display their state. Say you have a password field with a minimum length requirement of 8 characters. You can use these pseudo classes to show a red border for out of range and green for in range. Again, you can optionally use only one of them as per your requirement, like only indicating in range or out of range and leave standard styling otherwise. Border is not the only way. You have the selector for state. The entire CSS styling toolbox is at your disposal. Be creative. One generally used option is to show a label alongside control with suggestion or state indication, giving a textual as well as visual feedback at the same time. Perhaps the most critical ones are valid and invalid pseudo-classes. The attributes that we covered earlier indicate rules of validation like pattern, type, min, max, required, etc. If the data entered in input element follows all the rules you laid out, it would be assigned the prestigious valid pseudo-class, else the invalid pseudo-class. While useful and seemingly obvious, they make the styling trickier in combination. For example, a violation of min or max would apply both invalid as well as out of range pseudo-class on the element. While this gives you great flexibility in controlling UX for specific type of error, it gets muddy if you are styling for both pseudo-classes in your style sheet. In such case, the key to good UI is to be aware that both selectors would be triggered. Now your options are to either override one by the other, like out of range is a more specialized type of invalid input state. So you can style for invalid state first and then override that style by styling for out of range later. Say we are using border to indicate the state, this CSS would result in an out of range user input in orange. But that only worked as we were using the same border property in both styles, and the later was able to override the former. If, say, I also introduce background color red to invalid pseudo-class style, now the result of an out-of-range input would be orange border and red background. I hope you understand how this is controlled now. One last very important thing to mention here is that presence of elements with invalid pseudo-class would block form submission, and user would want to know why his form submission is blocked. So indicating erroneous elements at this point of time is critical to avoid user getting frustrated. I have seen countless sites making the mistake of not properly indicating which input element is invalid, making user go through each trying to identify himself via guesswork. Please never make this mistake. Final thought before we move on is that invalid item must be styled in your face kind of way to avoid any chance of user missing your hints. You can combine color-based styling as well as adding error labels or icons that appear only on error condition, prompting user to fix the problem. Finally, beware that a required item with no value is invalid with the invalid pseudo class in effect before user even touches it, just as the form gets displayed. So your styling efforts should keep this in mind before showing a blinking red label stating you forgot to fill in a required item. It would badly backfire as bad UX. There are techniques to avoid that behavior which are kind of beyond the scope of this introductory video to form validation by using a custom error class and a little bit of JavaScript, but I would hate to get distracted here. I'll provide link to one such technique in the description if you are interested. You have a variety of ways to communicate error messages, suggestions, and information to users with HTML and CSS. The most widely used is, of course, the creative use of colors to indicate states. Certain colors are pretty much universally associated with the success or failure, like red is associated with danger and problems, and green is generally associated with success. Borders, background, and label coloring is a good indicator of something going right or wrong for most users. In addition, you can always add icons and textual output in the mix. Tick marks or X signs or exclamation symbols are as effective as green and red, respectively, in conveying success or failure information. Note that the use of colors is not without its pitfalls, as a good percentage of user population is colorblind, and you can never count on color alone to convey information in a good production quality UI. So you must always combine colors with another non-color specific way to convey valid or invalid information like a text that appears only against invalid input elements. Just visualize your form to be used in both color and black and white monitors and you would get the idea. Relying on common sense is the biggest cause of issues in the web world. Not every user or visitor is as smart or web savvy as you are, and many people struggle to understand why their input was marked invalid, even if you think the reason is obvious. Bottom line, once a validation fails, a good UI must fingerhold the user out of the issue by conveying information that can help them out of the fix. Tooltips, pop-ups, labels that appear next to invalid input elements with suggestions to recover, and clear, concise reasoning for failure are effective strategies to help struggling users. Overdoing even the nice things is bad, like adding blinking red messages, against every failing input element, which may light up your entire form like a Christmas tree, and everyone would hate that. But you should think smartly about where to draw the line between too much information and conveying necessary information. There is no set formula, but the important rule must be kept in mind to make a good user experience when designing your form. HTML5 provides awesome built-in validation, saving you from writing custom JavaScript-based validation for most of the cases with just creative use of attributes. But many of times there are cases where built-in features can't do the required job of validation as the validation is more complex, custom, or involved. Taking example which we shall not cover in our coding part is that of unique user IDs or handles which may require a third-party API call or a call to your own server to reject user input if it is already taken. Or to take a simpler example, you are taking a seed value to run an algorithm and have a validation criteria for the seed value which is more involved than min or max. In such cases, you want to give user instant feedback but need to use your custom validation logic. Luckily, HTML5 presents the Constraint Validation API, which is a great tool to add custom logic while still maintaining the same error reporting and pseudo-classes based system. What's the catch? Well, a little bit of JavaScript needs to be added. Not much though. Just an event handler on the input element that you want to custom validate, and all you need to do is fetch the value as the user types, validate it, and based on your evaluation result, call a function on the object representing your input element with empty string for all OK or an error message for invalid case. The method in question is set custom validity, which when called on a DOM element makes its state invalid if called with a non-empty string. All your CSS rules on invalid value would kick in, and the HTML5 custom pop-ups for error messages would show your own customized message. And the JavaScript code you need to write is pretty basic, not something like walking on fire. We'll cover this case in our coding exercise, and you will see for yourself. There are third-party libraries that take that little coding part away as well, but I'll rather stick with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in this introductory video. That brings us to end of the concepts part. In the next video, we'll go to Visual Studio Code and write some code to see all of this in action. If you liked my video, please do give a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel to be notified of upcoming content. Thanks so much. Goodbye.